History is not a story of grand movements. It is a ledger of small entries, a quiet accounting of forgotten places and the people who were lost in them. This is one such entry, but the mountain did not want them there. Or perhaps it wanted them too much. Before we begin, if you're drawn to stories buried in old paper and darker places, consider subscribing. We tell what was never meant to be heard. The year was 1831. The season was spring, a time of cruel hope in the Appalachian basin of eastern Kentucky. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and new leaves, and on a forgotten spur of Black Mountain, the Clayridge Mining Company broke ground. The company was a Philadelphia enterprise, built on the ambition of a man named Mr. Silas Croft. He had never seen the Kentucky hills. He only saw the maps and the geologist reports. He saw the promise of wealth in the fine, dark slate that slept beneath the soil. He sent his money and his men into the wilderness. He expected a return on his investment. He would get one, but not the kind he had recorded in his ledgers. The site itself was a wound in the green landscape, a raw gash of mud and timber. It was remote, a 2-day ride from the nearest proper town of Sedalia. The trail was little more than a suggestion, a path of broken stones and sucking mud that fought every wagon wheel and every horse's hoof. To be sent to the Clayridge mine was to be sent to the edge of the world. The laborers were men who had run out of other options. They were Irish, mostly, fleeing a hunger in their own land, only to find a different kind here. They were paid little. They lived in crude timber shacks. The food was salted pork and hard bread. The water was drawn from a creek that ran brown with silt. The conditions were brutal, but the foreman promised the work was honest. The foreman was a man named Jedediah Hale. He was a hard man, born in these same mountains. He knew the rhythms of the rock and the moods of the men. He was not unkind, but he served the company. He had a wife and 4 children in a cabin 20 miles east. He sent his pay to them every month. He believed in the virtue of hard work. He believed that any problem could be solved with enough sweat and determination. This belief would be tested. It would be broken. With him came the company priest, Father Michael O'Connell. He was a young man from Boston, sent by the diocese to minister to the Catholic laborers. He was bookish and pale, a strange figure in the rough camp. He held mass on Sundays in a clearing of stumps. He heard confessions from men whose sins were simple things: greed, anger, despair. He did not yet know what true sin looked like. He would learn. For the first few weeks, the work was just that: work. The men cleared the land. They sank the main shaft. They used black powder and brute force, driving a tunnel into the side of the mountain. The air grew cool and still as they went deeper. The sunlight became a distant memory. They worked by the unsteady glow of carbide lamps, their faces smeared with soot, their bodies slick with sweat. The rock was rich. The slate came out in clean, heavy sheets. Jedediah Hale was pleased. He sent glowing reports back east to Mr. Silas Croft. The yield was promising. The men were working hard. The investment was sound. Then, at a depth of nearly 300 feet, they broke through into a new chamber. It was not like the others. The air was different. It was cold. A deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the earth and everything to do with something else. The chamber was a perfect dome, 100 feet across. The walls were smooth. Too smooth, as if polished by a great, slow-moving tide that had receded ages ago. And in the floor, they found the fissures. They were not cracks from blasting. They were not natural faults in the rock. They were a network of openings, a honeycomb of blackness that snaked down into the depths. They were ancient. The edges were worn smooth, like river stones. The openings were unnaturally narrow. Most were no bigger than a man's fist. The widest was perhaps a foot across. Too small for any man to enter, too small for a child. The miners gathered around them. They lowered lamps on ropes, but the light was swallowed by the dark. The lines went down 50, then 100 feet, and still found no bottom. They dropped pebbles into the mouths of the fissures and listened. They heard nothing. No echo, no splash, just a profound and final silence. Jedediah Hale noted the discovery in his logbook. He called them geological anomalies. He ordered the men to work around them. The slate in the chamber was of the highest quality. Production could not stop, but something had changed. The silence of the mine was no longer empty. It felt measured. It felt like it was listening. First came the noises. They started subtly, a scraping sound from deep within one of the fissures. So faint, the men thought it was the settling of the rock. Then it came again, a dry, dragging sound, the sound of something heavy being pulled over stone. Then came the breathing. It was not the sound of human lungs. It was rhythmic, but too slow. A long, dry inhalation, a pause that stretched for an uncomfortable time, then a soft, hissing exhale. It seemed to come from all the fissures at once. The men would stop their work, their picks held aloft, and listen. But when they listened, it would stop. It only ever happened at the edge of hearing, in the moments they were distracted. Then came the whispers. This was the thing that truly unnerved them. A man would be working, his mind on the stone in front of him, and he would hear a word, spoken softly in his ear. But the whisper was wrong. It seemed to echo before it was spoken, a psychic ripple in the air. A man named Finian, a young man with a wife back in Sedalia, swore he heard his wife call his name. He turned, and there was no one there. Another man, older, said he heard his mother, dead for 10 years, humming a lullaby. Jedediah Hale told them it was the pressure, the dark playing tricks on their minds. He told them to work harder, to ignore it. But then the tools started to go missing. A shovel, left leaning against a wall, would vanish. It would be found hours later at the other end of the chamber, its wooden handle splintered. A pickaxe disappeared, only to be discovered wedged deep inside one of the narrow fissures, its iron head bent at an impossible angle. Lamps were the worst. A man would set his carbide lamp on a ledge, turn his back for a moment, and find it gone. Later, they would find the shattered brass and broken glass in a far corner, as if it had been smashed with deliberate force. Jedediah Hale grew angry. He accused the men of sabotage, of thievery. He threatened to dock their pay. The men swore their innocence. Fear began to curdle the camp's morale. Fights broke out over small things. Men stopped speaking to each other. They started watching the shadows. They started watching the dark mouths of the fissures. The foreman, despite his bluster, was worried. He began making his rounds with a pistol holstered at his hip. He did not know what he was afraid of, but he felt its weight in the cold air. The final illusion of normalcy was shattered by a boy named Thomas. He was 12 years old, working as a trapper. His job was to open and close the ventilation doors in the tunnels. It was a lonely job for a boy. He spent his days in the dark, with only his own thoughts for company. One afternoon, Jedediah Hale was walking the lower chamber and found the boy pressed against the far wall. He was white as a sheet, his eyes wide with a terror so pure it seemed to have scoured him clean of all other emotion. He was pointing. His finger trembled. He could not speak. Jedediah followed his gaze. There, in a patch of fine gray dust that had settled near the widest of the fissures, were footprints. They were small, the size of a child's bare feet, but they were not human. There were too many toes, 7 on each foot. The prints were long and thin, and where the nails should have been, there were sharp, deep marks in the dust, like claws, like hooks that had dug into the ground for purchase. The tracks led from the mouth of the fissure, made a neat little circle in the dust, and then led back into the blackness. Jedediah Hale stared at the footprints for a long time. The cold of the chamber finally found its way into his bones. He knew, with a certainty that defied all reason, that these were not the tracks of any animal known to God or man. He felt a primal fear, the fear of something that crawls in the dark, the fear of a thing that should not be. He took a shovel and carefully, deliberately, erased the prints from the dust. He told the boy, Thomas, that he had seen nothing. He said it was a trick of the light. He gave the boy a silver coin and told him to never speak of it again. But it was too late. The story spread through the camp like a fever. The men's fear now had a shape. It was small, it was childlike, and it was crawling up from a place with no bottom. That night, no one slept. The men sat by their fires, their faces grim. They spoke in low voices. Some wanted to leave, to abandon the mine and the mountain to whatever lived beneath it. Others, bound by debt or desperation, argued to stay. Jedediah Hale sent a frantic message to Philadelphia. He told Mr. Silas Croft that the men were spooked, that there were complications. He did not mention the footprints. He did not mention the whispers. He knew how it would sound. The reply came a week later. It was terse, unsympathetic. Mr. Croft wrote that production was to be maintained at all costs. He suggested the foreman was losing control of his men. He did, however, authorize 2 actions. First, he ordered Father O'Connell to perform a blessing on the mine. A formal exorcism was out of the question. It would create a paper trail. It would admit a problem, but a simple blessing would soothe the superstitious Irish workers. Second, he authorized hazard pay, a 10% bonus for every man who continued to work the lower chamber. It was a bribe, plain and simple. A few extra dollars to make them forget the fear. Father O'Connell was deeply troubled. He told the foreman that a blessing was meant for a place touched by God, not for a place that felt so profoundly abandoned by him. He said he felt an active presence in the mine, a cold and patient malice. Jedediah Hale told him to do his duty. So the priest went down. He walked through the great, cold chamber, his vestments seeming frail and foolish in the oppressive dark. He sprinkled holy water that seemed to freeze in the air. He recited the Latin prayers, his voice small and thin against the listening silence. The men watched him, their faces full of a desperate hope. When he reached the honeycomb of fissures, he made the sign of the cross over them. As he did, a low hiss echoed up from the black openings. It was a sound of ancient contempt. The flame in the priest's lamp flickered, and for a moment, it burned a pale, sickly green. Father O'Connell finished the blessing and practically ran from the mine. He told Jedediah Hale that the prayer had not worked. He said it felt like he had only announced their presence. He said it felt like he had invited the darkness in. Jedediah ignored him. He gathered the men at the entrance to the shaft. He announced the hazard pay. He held up a bag of coins, the silver glittering in the morning sun. He spoke of their families, of their duty, of the wealth that lay just beneath their feet. The men looked at the coins. They looked at the dark mouth of the mine. They looked at each other. The fear was still in their eyes. But now, so was greed. One by one, they nodded. One by one, they agreed to go back down. They took the coin and squared their shoulders. They told themselves it was only rock and shadow, but the whispers from the fissures had begun to sound like names, and some of the men thought they recognized their own. Company money was a powerful balm for fear. For a time, the men went back into the earth. They swung their picks with a frantic energy, as if the rhythm of the work could drown out the listening silence. They spoke little. They did not whistle or sing. The only sounds were the ring of iron on stone, the scrape of shovels, and the slow, deep breathing from the fissures. The breathing was more constant now. After the priest's failed blessing, it had grown bolder. It no longer stopped when the men fell silent. It continued its slow, dry, patient rhythm, a counterpoint to their frantic labor. The air in the lower chamber grew colder still. A fine, white frost began to creep out from the edges of the narrow openings, tracing delicate fern-like patterns on the black stone. It was a cold that did not melt. Jedediah Hale pushed the men harder. He stayed in the chamber with them, his presence a mix of encouragement and threat. He told himself he was managing a difficult situation. He told himself the missing tools were theft, the whispers, exhaustion, the footprints, a prank. He wrote these lies in his logbook each night, the ink a testament to his own desperation. A man named Seamus O'Malley was the first to truly break. He was a quiet man, with a wife and a newborn daughter back in County Cork. He kept a small, tarnished silver locket with a lock of his child's hair inside. He would look at it during breaks, his big, calloused thumb tracing the worn engraving. The whispers had focused on him. They no longer just spoke his name. They described his home. They spoke of the salt spray on the coast. They hummed the tune his wife sang to their child. They knew things they had no right to know. He complained to Jedediah, his eyes wild. He said the thing below was trying to get inside his head. The foreman told him to get a hold of himself. He threatened to send him back to Sedalia without pay. Seamus grew gaunt. He stopped eating. He could not sleep. His fellow miners gave him a wide berth. They saw the terror in him and were afraid it was contagious. He started talking to himself, arguing with the whispers. He said they were liars. He said they could not have his family. One evening, Seamus returned to his shack to find his footlocker pried open. The few coins he had saved were still there. His spare clothes were untouched, but the silver locket was gone. He tore the small room apart, his cries turning to sobs. He accused the other men. A brutal fight broke out, which Jedediah Hale had to end with the butt of his pistol. The next morning, Seamus O'Malley was not at roll call. Jedediah was furious. He assumed Seamus had deserted in the night, shamed after the fight. He went to the man's shack to confirm. The door was ajar. Everything was as it had been. Seamus's boots were by the cot. His coat was on its peg. A man fleeing into the Kentucky wilderness would not leave his boots and coat behind. A cold knot formed in the foreman's stomach. He organized a search. The men fanned out through the woods around the camp. They shouted his name until their throats were raw. They found no tracks, No sign of his passage. It was as if he had simply been lifted out of the world. After hours of fruitless searching, Jedediah Hale took a lamp and went down into the mine alone. He did not know what he was looking for. He felt a dreadful compulsion. The silence was absolute. The deep, rhythmic breathing had stopped. The mine was holding its breath, waiting. He walked into the lower chamber. The air was frigid. He held his lamp high, its light pushing back a darkness that felt solid. He walked to the fissure nearest the spot where Seamus had been working the day before. He ran his hand along the cold stone. His fingers snagged on something. He lowered the lamp. There, scratched crudely into the rock beside the narrow opening, was a name, Seamus. The letters were sharp, deep. They looked fresh, as if they had been carved with a nail or a claw. Jedediah stared at the name, and the cold knot in his stomach became a shard of ice. He looked at the fissure. The opening was no wider than his shoulders were broad. It was a black, silent throat. He felt a sudden, overwhelming conviction that Seamus O'Malley was down there, in the dark. What was left of him? He backed away slowly. He did not run. He walked with a stiff, deliberate gait back to the surface. He did not tell the men what he had found. He simply announced that the search was over. He said that Seamus had clearly run off. He scratched the name off the company roster. He made a note in his logbook. One man deserted. The lie felt heavy in his hand as he wrote it. But the men knew. They did not need to see the carving in the stone. They felt the absence of Seamus O'Malley like a physical weight. There were now 29 of them. The disappearances began to happen with a quiet regularity. It was never dramatic. There was never a scream. A man would simply not be there for the morning roll call. His bunk would be empty, his possessions untouched. 2 days after Seamus, a man named Declan was gone. He was a large, boisterous man who had laughed at the stories, who had said it was only the mountain groaning in its sleep. The foreman found his name carved next to another fissure, Declan. A week later, it was 2 brothers, Cormac and Finn. They had been inseparable. They vanished on the same night. Jedediah Hale found their names carved side by side near the widest of the openings. With each disappearance, the thing below seemed to grow. The scraping sounds became louder, bolder. Sometimes the men would hear it moving just beneath the floor of the chamber, a dry dragging sound that paced them as they worked. The whispers became a constant, murmuring chorus. They promised things. Riches, a safe journey home, the love of a woman a man had lost. They learned the secret hopes and fears of every man in the camp and used them as hooks. The men started to leave, not in a flood, but in a steady trickle. 2 or 3 a night would slip away from the camp, taking nothing with them but the terror on their faces. They did not care about the money anymore. Jedediah Hale stopped marking them down as deserters. He simply scratched their names from the roster. He stopped going down into the lower chamber to look for the carvings. He did not want to know. He did not want to see the tally on the stone. Father O'Connell, the priest, had locked himself in his small chapel. He had abandoned his duties to the men. He spent his days and nights in a fever of prayer and research. He had sent a letter by courier to the diocesan archives in Boston, begging for information, for any record of exorcisms or spiritual maladies in the Appalachian region, for any mention of entities that crawled up from the earth. He pored over his Bible, his fingers tracing the passages about demons and things that dwell in the deep places of the world. He felt he was on the edge of a terrible understanding. The evil in the mine was not a simple spirit. It was not a ghost. It was something older, something elemental. It was the hunger of the rock itself. It did not possess. It consumed. It did not want their souls. It wanted their bodies. It wanted their names. It wanted the space they occupied in the world. He began to have nightmares. He dreamt of a narrow, dark space. He dreamt he was crawling, the rock scraping his skin raw. He dreamt of a small, pale hand reaching for him in the blackness. He would wake up screaming, the name of God a bitter taste on his tongue. The number of men dwindled, 25, 20, 15. Jedediah Hale's reports to Philadelphia became more and more erratic. He begged for permission to seal the lower chamber, to abandon the site. The reply from Mr. Silas Croft was always the same. Production must be maintained. The yield from the lower chamber was the purest slate he had ever seen. He accused Jedediah of incompetence. He threatened him with legal action. He reminded him of the contract he had signed. Jedediah Hale felt a trap closing around him. He was bound to the mine by the company's greed. He was bound to it by the men he had led there. He was bound to it by the names carved in the stone below. He began drinking heavily. The whiskey did not dull the fear. It only sharpened the edges. One night, he sat in his office, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and his pistol in the other. He stared at the company roster. There were only 12 names left. His own was at the top. He looked at the names, and for the first time, he let himself truly think about the thing in the mine. It was intelligent. It was patient. It was learning. First, it had learned their fears. Then it had learned their names. What was it learning now? The thought was interrupted by a soft, scratching sound. It was not coming from the mine. It was coming from outside his door. A slow, rhythmic scrape, like a fingernail being dragged across the wood. Jedediah Hale froze. He held his breath. The scratching stopped. Then came a soft, childish giggle. It was a sound of pure, untainted malice. It was the sound of a thing that was enjoying its game. The foreman did not open the door. He sat in his chair all night, his pistol pointed at the thin pine boards, and listened to the silence. The next morning, he went to the storage shed. He took every barrel of black powder the company had left. He enlisted the remaining 12 men. Their faces were hollowed out by fear. They looked like old men. They did not need to be asked. They knew what had to be done. He was no longer a company foreman. He was a man trying to bury a monster. He told them they were going to seal the mine. They were going to seal the lower chamber first. They would collapse the entrance. They would wipe this place from the earth. He did not know that they were already too late. He did not know that the fissures were not just a way down. They were also a way up. The honeycomb of blackness was not a simple well. It was a root system. It spread through the rock in all directions, a web of dark veins reaching for the surface, for the air, for the light. Jedediah Hale did not know this with his mind. He knew it with the cold dread that now lived permanently in his gut. The scratching at his door had not been a ghost. It had been a scout. The next morning, the sun rose into a sky the color of dirty dishwater. The air was still and heavy. The 12 remaining miners gathered in the clearing. They were not men anymore. They were ghosts waiting for their graves. Their faces were carved with exhaustion and a terror so profound it had burned away all other feeling. They looked at Jedediah Hale with hollow eyes. They did not need persuasion. They were ready. They worked with a grim, silent efficiency. They rolled the heavy barrels of black powder from the storage shed, the iron hoops groaning in the damp air. They were preparing for their final act of defiance. A desperate, hopeless attempt to put the lid back on a box that should never have been opened. As they were about to carry the first barrel to the shaft entrance, a figure stumbled out of the small building that served as the chapel. It was Father Michael O'Connell. He was a wreck of a man. His black cassock was stained and rumpled. His eyes were wide, blazing with a feverish light. He had lost days to his books and his nightmares. He clutched a sheaf of papers in one trembling hand. They were covered in his own frantic scrawl. He ran towards the men, his voice a raw croak. He told them to stop. He begged them. He said they did not understand what they were doing. He waved the papers in Jedediah's face. He babbled about a book he had found referenced in a letter from a Jesuit missionary, dated 1742, a forbidden text. It spoke of the spirits of the deep earth in this part of the world. It called the entity a collector, a thing that did not haunt, but harvested. The priest said it was drawn to places of great toil and misery. It fed on the echoes of human life. It learned the shape of a man, his voice, his fears, his name. Then it made room for him. It hollowed him out. It pulled him down into the rock and left his name as a marker, a receipt for a purchase made. He said sealing the lower chamber would be like trying to drown a fish by throwing a rock in its pond. He said the fissures were not just an entrance, they were its lungs. The entire mountain was its body. To anger, it was to invite a more terrible intimacy. Jedediah Hale listened, his face a mask of stone. He saw the madness in the priest's eyes. He saw the ravings of a man broken by fear. He could not accept this story. His world was one of rock and timber, of black powder and profit and loss. He could fight a thing that lived in a hole. He could not fight a living mountain. He chose to believe in the hole. He gently pushed the priest aside. He told him to go back to his chapel and pray. He told his men to pick up the barrels. Father O'Connell watched them, his face crumbling in despair. He sank to his knees in the mud, the papers fluttering from his grasp. He began to whisper prayers, not for the men's salvation, but for the swiftness of their end. The descent was a journey into the throat of a beast. Each of the 12 men, plus Jedediah, carried a lamp. Their small lights did little to push back the oppressive, waiting dark. They moved the barrels one by one, using ropes and brute strength to lower them down the main shaft. then rolling them along the sloping tunnel. The silence was gone. The whispers were a constant layered symphony now. They were intimate, personal. A young man named Liam heard his deceased father's voice, chiding him for his failures. An older miner, Patrick, heard the sweet promises of a woman he had courted and lost 50 years before. Jedediah Hale heard only the sound of children laughing, a joyful, innocent sound that was somehow the most terrifying of all. They reached the great domed chamber. The cold was a physical presence. It sank its teeth into their bones. The frost creeping from the fissures now covered half the floor, a white, sterile cancer on the stone. It crunched under their boots, and they saw the names. The walls were covered in them. Not just the dozen or so that Jedediah had expected. There were scores of them. Hundreds. Carved in neat, sharp letters. Seamus, Declan, Cormac, Finn. But beside them were others, names they did not recognize. Abraham, Isaac, Josiah, and further back, in the shadows, names that were not English, faded carvings in what looked like Spanish. And below those, even older marks, symbols and pictograms Jedediah did not recognize. The history of this place was written on the walls, a ledger of the consumed, stretching back into a time before maps. The men stared, their resolve faltering. This was not their tragedy alone. They were just the latest entry in a very old book. Jedediah roared at them to move. His voice, raw with his own terror, broke the spell. They worked with the speed of panic. They positioned the barrels, a half dozen of them, spaced evenly throughout the chamber. They worked the drills, making holes for the charges. The whispers grew to a roar, a psychic storm that beat against their skulls. It was the sound of 1,000 stolen voices all speaking at once. One man, Liam, the one who heard his father's voice, suddenly dropped his drill. He clapped his hands over his ears and began to scream. He said his father was telling him to stay, that it was warm down below, that they had made a place for him. He turned and took a step towards the widest fissure. 2 of the other men tackled him, dragging him back from the edge. He fought them, his eyes vacant, his strength unnatural. Jedediah Hale knew they had seconds. He finished connecting the fuses himself, his hands shaking but his movements sure. He created one long, central fuse that snaked back towards the tunnel entrance. He looked at the men. He looked at Liam, who was now sobbing on the ground. He looked at the names on the wall. He gave the order to retreat. They scrambled back up the tunnel, dragging the near catatonic Liam with them. Jedediah was the last. He knelt at the entrance to the chamber, struck a match, and touched the flame to the fuse. It caught instantly, a small orange spark eating its way along the black cord, a brave, tiny thing in the face of so much darkness. Jedediah turned and ran. The men half ran, half stumbled up the main tunnel, their lungs burning from the cold air and the exertion. The light from their lamps danced wildly on the rough-hewn walls. Behind them, the fuse burned on, a promise of fire and oblivion. They did not look back. They looked ahead, towards the sliver of gray daylight that marked the mine's entrance. The way out. They were halfway to the surface when they heard it. It was not from behind them. It did not come from the chamber they had just left. It came from the darkness ahead of them. It was a soft scraping sound. And then, a giggle. A child's giggle, echoing down the tunnel. It was the same sound Jedediah had heard outside his door. A small figure stepped out of the shadows of a side passage they had dug weeks ago. It was the boy, Thomas, the young trapper. He stood in the middle of the tunnel, blocking their path. He held a rusty miner's pick in one small hand. He was smiling. But the smile was wrong. It was too wide. It stretched his pale face into a grotesque mask. His eyes were the color of the fissure frost. They were ancient and empty. He spoke, but the voice was not his. It was a layered chorus of whispers, a dozen stolen voices speaking as one. He told them they were foolish. He said the fire was a nuisance, but it would not hurt the house. It would only smoke out the other guests. He took a step forward, dragging the pick behind him. The metal claw scraped a long, sharp line in the stone floor. He said it had made room for them, and it did not need much. The sight of the boy broke them. This was a horror they could understand. Not a whisper from a hole in the ground, but a corrupted, familiar face. The men behind Jedediah Hale stopped dead, a tangle of limbs and panicked breaths. The gray daylight of the entrance was so close. Freedom was 100 feet away. And standing in the path was a 12-year-old child, holding a pickaxe and wearing the eyes of a monster. The boy, Thomas, took another step. The chorus of voices that came from his mouth was lower now, almost a growl. It said they had been very loud. It said they had disturbed the sleep of the quiet ones. Behind them, deep in the mine, a low rumble began. The fuse, the black powder. The men were caught between a coming explosion and the small, smiling thing in front of them. Jedediah Hale did not hesitate. The foreman, the company man, was gone. All that remained was a cornered animal. He raised the heavy pistol he still carried. He leveled it at the boy's chest. His hand was steady. His mind was a cold, clear void. The other men cried out. They shouted, "No, it's just the boy." But Jedediah saw what they did not. He saw that the boy was already gone. This was just the shape he had left behind. "Get out of the way, Thomas," Jedediah said, his voice flat. The boy giggled again. The sound scraped along Jedediah's nerves. The layered voice replied that Thomas was not here anymore. Thomas was down below. He was learning the old songs. From deep within the mine, the rumble intensified. The ground beneath their feet trembled. Dust rained down from the timber supports overhead. The explosion was coming, seconds away. Jedediah Hale fired the pistol. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The flame and smoke belched from the barrel. The heavy lead ball struck the boy square in the chest. The impact threw him backwards, off his feet. He landed in a heap on the stone floor. The pickaxe clattered from his grasp. For a moment, there was silence. The men stared, horrified at what their foreman had done. They had just watched him shoot a child. Then, the boy sat up. There was no blood. There was no wound. The front of his simple wool shirt was torn, but the skin beneath was pale and unbroken. He looked down at his chest with an expression of mild curiosity. Then he looked back at Jedediah. The smile was gone. His face was a blank canvas of ancient, cold fury. The layered voice spoke again, this time with a new edge. An edge of annoyance. It said that the flesh was borrowed and easily mended. It said the foreman was being rude. The ground bucked violently. A deep, cracking roar echoed up the shaft. The explosion. A wave of superheated air and dust shot up the tunnel, a hurricane of debris. It slammed into the men, throwing them forward. Lamps were extinguished. The world became a storm of darkness, noise, and pain. Jedediah was thrown against the tunnel wall. The pistol flew from his hand. His head struck the rock, and for a moment, the world dissolved into a smear of gray light and sharp, stabbing pain. He fought for consciousness, gasping in the dust-choked air. The roar from the lower chamber faded, replaced by a new sound. The groaning of stressed timbers, the sharp crack of splitting rock. Their desperate act had not just sealed the chamber, it had fatally wounded the mine itself. The entire structure was collapsing. Through the ringing in his ears, Jedediah heard the screams of his men. He pushed himself to his hands and knees. The tunnel was almost completely dark. The only light was the pale daylight from the entrance, now partially obscured by a cloud of dust. He saw shapes moving in the gloom, men scrambling, crawling over each other, desperate to reach the light. He looked for the boy. Thomas was gone. In the spot where he had fallen, there was nothing. No body, no blood, just the discarded pickaxe. Jedediah Hale got to his feet and ran. He joined the frantic exodus, a stampede of terror. They clawed their way towards the entrance, their lungs on fire. Behind them, the tunnel groaned its death agony. Sections of the roof began to fall, great slabs of rock and timber crashing down where they had stood only seconds before. They burst out into the gray daylight, falling and tumbling down the muddy slope from the mine entrance. They were a vision from hell. 13 men, caked in dirt and blood, their faces masks of sheer, animal panic. They did not stop. They ran past the silent chapel, past the foreman's office, past the crude shacks. They ran for the woods. Behind them, the mountain gave a final, great sigh. The ground shook one last time. The entrance to the Clayridge mine collapsed completely. A tidal wave of earth, rock, and splintered timber slid down the hillside, burying the opening under tons of rubble. Where there had been a dark mouth, there was now only a scar, a tombstone of raw earth. Silence fell, a profound, ringing silence. The only sound was the ragged, desperate breathing of the survivors. They huddled at the edge of the tree line, looking back at the camp. At the sealed mine, they were alive. They had escaped. A wave of exhausted relief washed over them. One of the men began to laugh, a high, unhinged sound. Another began to weep openly. Jedediah Hale stood apart, his chest heaving. He looked at the collapsed entrance. He had buried it. He had sealed the hole. But he had seen the boy. He had seen the empty eyes. He had shot him, and the boy had gotten up. The hole was sealed, but the thing was not in the hole anymore. He turned to his men. There were 12 of them. No, 11. He scanned their faces. His mind, still reeling, tried to do the math. 13 had gone in. They had left Liam, the catatonic miner, in the chamber. He was gone, consumed by the blast. That made 12. But there were only 11 men standing with him. He counted again. He pointed, his finger trembling. 1, 2, 3. He went down the line. 11. Who was missing? His mind raced, pulling up the roster from memory. He pictured the men who had descended with him. Patrick, Michael, Sean, a young man named Rory. A quiet, steady man who had been right behind him in the retreat. "Where is Rory?" Jedediah asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. The men looked around, their expressions turning from relief back to confusion and fear. They called his name. No answer. He had been with them. They were sure of it. He had made it out. Then, one of the men pointed. He was pointing back at the camp, back towards the foreman's office. There, standing in the doorway of the small timber building, was a figure. It was Rory. He was just standing there, perfectly still, looking at them. "Rory!" One of the men shouted, a note of relief in his voice. "Come on, we have to go." Rory did not move. He simply raised a hand and waved, a slow, gentle wave, a wave of farewell. Then he turned and walked back inside the office. Jedediah Hale felt a cold that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the rock beneath his feet, what he would find if he went into that office. He knew that the real Rory was buried under 1,000 tons of rock. He knew that the thing they had seen was just an echo, a stolen shape. The entity had not been sealed in, it had been flushed out. Jedediah grabbed the nearest man by the arm. His voice was a command. "We leave. Now." There was no argument. They turned their backs on the camp, on the sealed mine, on the ghost of their friend standing in the office doorway. They plunged into the dense Appalachian forest, running without a destination, running only away. They ran until their lungs gave out. They ran until the sun began to set, casting long, grasping shadows through the trees. They finally collapsed in a heap in a small, mossy clearing, miles from the mine. For a long time, no one spoke. They were 11 survivors of a battle they did not understand. They had faced something ancient and impossible, and somehow they were alive. As darkness fell, a new fear began to creep in, the fear of the woods. Every rustle of leaves was a footstep. Every snap of a twig was a presence. They built a large, roaring fire, huddling close to its light as if the flames could burn away the memory of the cold in the mine. They were 11 men, strangers to each other just months ago, now bound by a shared, unspeakable trauma. They had no food, no water beyond a small creek, no tools, no weapons, save for their bare hands. As the night deepened, the man named Patrick, the one who had heard the sweet promises of his lost love, began to hum a tune. It was an old Irish love song. The melody was sad and sweet. He hummed it softly, staring into the flames. Then, from the darkness just beyond the ring of firelight, another voice joined his. It was a soft, feminine voice, humming the same tune in perfect harmony. Patrick stopped humming. His head snapped up, his eyes widened. He stared into the blackness between the trees. "Mary?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Mary, is that you?" The voice from the darkness giggled. It was not a sweet sound. It was the giggle of a child, the same giggle they had heard in the tunnel. Panic erupted. The men scrambled to their feet, staring wildly into the woods. They saw nothing, but they heard it, the whispers. They had followed them. They were all around them, in the rustling leaves, in the sighing of the wind. The whispers knew their names. They knew their fears. The mine was gone, but the voice of the mine was with them. It had followed them out. Or perhaps it had been waiting for them out here all along. The thing was not trapped in the mountain. The clearing, once a sanctuary, became a cage. The fire, once a comfort, now cast dancing, monstrous shadows that played tricks on their eyes. The 11 men were a tight knot of terror, their backs to the flames, their faces turned to the impenetrable wall of the night. The whispers were everywhere, a soft, sibilant chorus that rose and fell with the wind. They were no longer trying to tempt or persuade, they were mocking them. A man named Sean, a big man with a thick beard, started shouting into the darkness. He hurled curses. He screamed threats. He dared the thing to show itself. His voice was raw with defiance, but it was the defiance of a cornered rat. The whispers only laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. Jedediah Hale tried to restore order. He knew that panic was a fire that, once lit, would consume them all. He grabbed Sean by the shoulder, his voice low and urgent. He told him to be quiet. He said that noise was what it wanted. It fed on their fear. It fed on their voices. They had to be silent. They had to be still. But the silence was worse. In the silence, they could hear the other sounds. A faint scraping from the trees to their left. The snap of a large branch from their right. The soft, dragging sound of something heavy being pulled through the undergrowth, circling them, always circling. They spent the night huddled together, sleepless, listening. Every man was lost in his own private hell, besieged by the ghosts of his past, by whispers only he could hear. Jedediah watched them. He saw men who had been strong and capable reduced to trembling children. He felt a profound, soul-crushing guilt. He had led them here. He had kept them here. Their fate was his responsibility. When the first, thin, gray light of dawn broke through the canopy, it brought no relief. The woods did not seem less menacing. They only seemed more real. The men's faces were pale and drawn, their eyes rimmed with red. They looked at each other, and in each other's faces, they saw their own doom reflected. Jedediah knew they could not stay. To stay was to die. Their only hope was to reach Sedalia. The town was 2 days hard travel, maybe more without a trail to follow. It was a slim hope, but it was the only one they had. He got the men to their feet. He told them to move. He pointed in the direction he believed was east, towards civilization, towards other people, towards light. They began to walk. It was not a march. It was a shambling, stumbling flight. They moved through the dense forest, thorns and branches tearing at their clothes and skin. The whispers followed. They were quieter now, a faint murmur at the edge of hearing, a constant reminder that they were not alone. And they began to see things, a flicker of movement in their peripheral vision, the shape of a small child, half hidden behind a tree, that would vanish when they turned to look. A set of footprints in a patch of soft mud, child-sized but with too many toes, that seemed to parallel their path. Once, they came across a small, dead bird lying on the trail. Its wings were neatly folded. Its head was twisted completely around. They lost a man that first day. His name was Michael. He was a devout man who had clung to his rosary since the ordeal began. He had been growing more and more withdrawn, his lips constantly moving in silent prayer. Around midday, as they crossed a shallow, fast-moving stream, Michael simply stopped. He stood in the middle of the icy water, his face turned upwards, a look of serene peace on his face. Jedediah called to him. The others shouted his name. Michael did not seem to hear them. He smiled, a beatific, empty smile. He said that he heard the angels singing. He said they were calling him home. He turned and began to walk upstream, away from them, deeper into the wilderness. He was still smiling when the woods swallowed him from view. They did not follow him. They knew he was already lost. Now there were 10. That night, they did not risk a fire. They found a small, shallow cave, little more than a rocky overhang, and huddled together in the damp cold. The whispers grew louder in the enclosed space. They told stories, horrible, intimate stories of each man's deepest shames and secret sins. They spoke of things a man had done as a boy, things he thought no one knew. They spoke of betrayals and small cruelties, peeling back the layers of each man's soul until all that was left was raw, quivering guilt. A fight broke out between two men, Patrick and a quiet man named Aowen. The whispers had told Patrick that Aowen had stolen bread from his pack weeks ago. It was a small thing, a nothing. But in the charged atmosphere of terror and paranoia, it was a spark in a powder keg. They fought with a desperate, ugly violence until Jedediah and the others pulled them apart. The trust between them was broken. They were no longer a group. They were a collection of terrified individuals, each one an island of fear. The next morning, Eowyn was gone. He had not been taken. He had fled. His tracks led away from the cave, alone, into the woods. The men said nothing. They all understood. Eowyn had chosen to face the woods alone rather than stay with them. Now there were 9. Their journey continued. They were weaker now, stumbling from hunger and exhaustion. The world had taken on a dreamlike, unreal quality. The woods seemed to shift and change around them. A tree they had passed an hour before would seem to reappear in front of them. The sun seemed to hang in the same spot in the sky for hours. They were walking, but they were not getting anywhere. They were trapped in a labyrinth of trees and shadows, with the whispers as their constant companions. That afternoon, they came to a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a single, massive oak tree. It was ancient, its branches like gnarled arms reaching for the sky. The sight of it stopped them in their tracks. It felt important. It felt like a destination. Hanging from the lowest branches of the tree were dozens of small, man-made objects. They swayed gently in the breeze. There were carved wooden birds, bundles of feathers tied with string, strips of cloth, and tarnished silver lockets. One of the men, his voice a dry croak, pointed. He had recognized his own missing tin whistle. Another saw a pocket knife that had vanished from his belt days ago. They were trophies. A collection of small, personal items taken from the miners, from the living and from the dead. And at the base of the tree, half buried in the dirt, was a company logbook. Its leather cover was warped by moisture. Jedediah Hale walked towards it as if in a trance. He knew it was not his. He knelt and opened it. The pages were filled with elegant, spidery handwriting. It was a Spanish priest's journal, dated 1695. He could only read a few words of the Spanish, but he saw the names. He saw the frantic, desperate prayers. And he saw the drawings, sketches of small, narrow fissures in the rock, and a drawing of a child with a too-wide smile and empty eyes. As Jedediah stared at the book, he heard a sound from behind him. It was Patrick, the man who had heard his lost love humming in the dark. He was walking towards the tree, his eyes fixed on one of the swaying objects. It was a small, delicate lace handkerchief. "Mary," he whispered again. He reached out a trembling hand. As his fingers brushed against the lace, the whispers stopped. A total, profound silence fell over the clearing, and from the other side of the great oak, a small figure stepped out. It was the boy, Thomas. He was not smiling. His face was calm, impassive. He looked at Patrick with his cold, frost-colored eyes. He spoke, and for the first time the voice was his own, a clear, childish treble. He said, "She has been waiting for you, Patrick." Patrick began to sob, great, racking sobs of grief and joy and terror all mixed together. He took a step towards the boy. Jedediah screamed at him to stop. He scrambled to his feet, reaching for the man, but it was too late. As Patrick took another step, the ground beneath his feet gave way. It did not collapse. It opened. A perfect, narrow fissure appeared in the soft earth, a black, silent mouth. Patrick fell into it without a sound. The earth closed over him as if he had never been. The boy, Thomas, looked at the remaining 8 men. He tilted his head, and he smiled. He said, "Who is next?" The question hung in the unnatural silence of the clearing. It was not a threat. It was a simple, courteous inquiry. The boy, Thomas, stood by the ancient oak, a small, patient host waiting for his guests to choose their rooms. The fissure that had swallowed Patrick was gone, leaving no trace in the soft earth. It was as if a door had opened and then closed. The 8 remaining men stared, paralyzed. The raw, primal horror of what they had just witnessed short-circuited their minds. They had seen a man erased from the world. It was Sean, the big man who had cursed the darkness, who broke the spell. He did not run. He did not scream. A strange, fatalistic calm settled over his features. He looked at the boy. He looked at the swaying trinkets on the tree. He looked at Jedediah Hale, a flicker of something like pity in his eyes. He turned back to the boy. "Me," he said. His voice was steady. "I am." Jedediah shouted his name. "Sean, no, don't listen to it." Sean ignored him. He took a step forward, then another. He walked with a heavy, deliberate tread, the walk of a man going to the gallows. He stopped a few feet from the boy. He looked down at the child-shaped thing that had taken so much from them. The boy tilted his head, his empty eyes studying Sean's face. The layered, whispering voice returned, soft as rustling silk. It said that Sean was a brave man. It said he had a strong voice. It said his voice would make a fine addition to the choir. Sean looked at the boy and asked a simple question. Why? The entity seemed to consider this. The whispers swirled, a vortex of stolen thoughts and dead men's voices. Then, the boy's own voice, clear and cold, answered. It said it was lonely. It said the mountain was a quiet place. It said it had slept for a long time. Then the men had come. They had made so much noise. They had woken it up, and it had found that it liked the noise. It liked the stories in their heads. It liked their names. It was collecting them, like a child collects pretty stones. As the boy spoke, the ground at Sean's feet began to soften. A dark line appeared, then widened. A new fissure, black and hungry. Sean did not look down. He kept his eyes locked on the boy. He said, "Tell my wife I love her." The entity smiled, its too wide smile. The whispering chorus answered for it. It said it would. It said it would tell her every night, in her dreams. Sean closed his eyes. The ground gave way. He was gone. The earth healed itself, leaving not even a scar. Now, there were 7. The remaining men broke. The sight of Sean's calm, deliberate suicide was more terrifying than Patrick's panicked fall. It was an act of surrender, an admission that there was no escape. They scattered, running blindly back into the woods, their screams tearing the quiet air. They ran in every direction, a panicked herd with no shepherd. Jedediah Hale stood frozen for a moment, watching them go. He was the foreman, the leader. He should have stopped them. He should have kept them together. But he knew it was pointless. The thing was not a wolf that could be fought off by the pack. It was a plague that picked them off one by one, using their own minds as the weapon. Staying together only meant they would have to watch each other die. He turned and ran, plunging into the forest, choosing a direction at random. He ran with the last dregs of his strength, his mind a howling wasteland of guilt and terror. He did not look back. He did not want to see the boy standing under his trophy tree, patiently waiting. He ran for hours. The sun began to dip below the horizon, and the woods grew dark again. He was alone, utterly, completely alone. For the first time since leaving the mine, he could not hear the whispers. The silence was absolute. He did not know if this was a reprieve or a new form of torture. He finally collapsed at the base of a rock face, his body a screaming agony of exhaustion and pain. He had nothing left. He curled into a ball on the damp ground, shivering, and waited for the end. He expected to hear the giggle. He expected to see the boy step out from behind a tree. He waited for the ground to open up and take him, but nothing happened. The silence held. He drifted into a shallow, feverish sleep, haunted by images of falling men and empty eyes. He was awoken by a sound. It was not a whisper. It was a voice, a real voice, a man's voice, calling out. Jedediah's eyes snapped open. He lay still, listening. The voice came again, closer this time. It was calling a name. Jedediah? Jedediah Hale? Hope, a feeling he thought had been scoured from him, flickered faintly in his chest. He pushed himself up. He was weak, dizzy with hunger. He stumbled out from the rock overhang. Standing in the pre-dawn gloom was a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in the dark, simple clothes of a traveling preacher. He held a lantern, and its warm, yellow light seemed to push back the oppressive shadows of the woods. It was the first kind light Jedediah had seen in days. The man saw him and his face broke into a relieved smile. "Mr. Hale, thank God. I am Father Michael O'Connell." Jedediah stared. It took his battered mind a moment to process. This was not the broken, terrified priest from the camp. This man was calm. His eyes were clear and steady. The feverish madness was gone, replaced by a grim, quiet purpose. "Father?" Jedediah croaked, his voice raw. "What? How?" Father O'Connell helped him to sit, giving him a canteen of water. The cool liquid was the best thing Jedediah had ever tasted. The priest explained. After the mine collapsed, after the remaining men had fled, he had stayed. He had hidden in the chapel, praying, watching. He saw the thing that wore Rory's face. He knew then that his fears were real. The evil had escaped. He had not run. He had gone back to his books, to the frantic notes he had made. The Jesuit journal had mentioned a name, a specific name for the entity, not a demon, but something else. It called it a Gia's taker, a spirit of the land that bound itself to a place and bound people to it through promises and stolen knowledge. The journal spoke of a way to break the bond, not to kill it. An idea like that was foolish, but to sever its connection to the people it had marked. The ritual was old, pagan perhaps, dressed up in Christian language by the desperate Jesuit. It required an offering, an exchange, a name for a name. "I found the others," the priest said, his voice low and heavy with grief. "Or what was left of them. I found them one by one. I performed the rites. I gave the Gia's taker a new name to learn. My own." He looked Jedediah in the eye. "It took the bargain. It is bound to me now. The whispers are with me, always. But you, the rest of you, you are free of its sight. Jedediah stared at the priest, at the profound sacrifice in the man's calm eyes. The others? He asked, dreading the answer. They are gone, Jedediah. Father O'Connell said softly. All of them. The woods took them. I was too late for them, but not for you. You are the only one left. Jedediah Hale, the hard foreman, the man of rock and iron, began to weep. He wept for Seamus and Declan, for the brothers, Cormac and Finn, for brave Sean and lost Patrick. He wept for all the names on the company roster. He wept for the man he used to be. Father O'Connell let him cry. When the sobs subsided, he helped Jedediah to his feet. We must go, he said. My bargain will not hold it forever. It is patient. It will learn its way around the rules. We must be far from this place when it does. They walked together. The priest, a man carrying a monster in his own mind, and the foreman, a man haunted by the ghosts of his crew. For the first time, the woods felt like just woods. The silence was just silence. The spell was broken. Jedediah was no longer being hunted. They traveled for a full day, the priest sharing what little food he had. They spoke little. There was nothing left to say. The shared horror was a bond between them that words could not touch. Late in the afternoon, they crested a ridge, and below them, they saw it, a thin curl of smoke rising into the air. A road, the town of Sedalia, civilization. A wave of feeling so intense it was painful washed over Jedediah. It was over. He had survived. He turned to Father O'Connell, his throat thick with emotion. He tried to find the words to thank him. But the priest was not looking at the town. He was looking back, into the deep woods they had just left. His face was pale. A single bead of sweat traced a path down his temple. Father, Jedediah asked. Father O'Connell turned to him. His eyes were no longer calm. The old fear was back, mixed with a new confusion. It's quiet, the priest whispered. Too quiet. What do you mean? The whispers, he said, a tremor in his voice. They've stopped. He looked at Jedediah, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrible realization. The bargain, it wanted a name, a leader's name. It wanted the foreman of the Clayridge mining company. He took a half step back from Jedediah. It did not take my name, it took yours. The priest's eyes darted past Jedediah's shoulder. His face went slack with terror. Jedediah turned. Standing on the path behind them, not 20 feet away, was the boy, Thomas. He was holding a single, tarnished silver locket. He held it out, as if offering it. He smiled, and in the voice of a dozen dead men, he whispered, "You forgot something, Mr. Hale." The world seemed to shrink, until it contained only 3 figures on a lonely ridge. Jedediah Hale, the man who thought he was free. Father O'Connell, the man who thought he was a sacrifice. And the boy, who was neither. The silver locket, Seamus O'Malley's lost treasure, dangled from the child's fingers, catching the last rays of the dying sun. It swung back and forth like a hypnotist's watch. Jedediah stared at it, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. The woods behind the boy were just woods again. The air was clear, but the creature was here. It had walked out of its domain. It had followed them to the very edge of the civilized world. No, Father O'Connell whispered, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The ritual, the exchange, it was a lie. The boy, Thomas, turned his empty gaze to the priest. The whispering chorus came from his smiling mouth, tinged with something like amusement. It said the priest's offering was appreciated. But it was insufficient. It said the priest was a shepherd, but the flock was not his. The flock belonged to the man who had led them into the pasture, the man whose name was at the top of the roster. It had been toying with the priest. It had let him believe his sacrifice had worked. It had allowed him to lead Jedediah out of the woods, a final, cruel act of theater. It wanted to deliver its property to the threshold of his salvation, only to snatch it away. It was not just a collector, it was a sadist. "Run, Jedediah," Father O'Connell screamed, his voice breaking. He took a step towards the boy, his hands raised as if to ward off an evil he knew he could not touch. "Get to the town. Don't look back." The priest lunged. He did not try to attack the boy. He ran past him, a desperate gambit to draw the creature's attention, a final, selfless act. The boy did not even turn to look at him. He kept his frost-colored eyes locked on Jedediah. As Father O'Connell ran past, the entity simply raised its free hand. It made a small, dismissive gesture in the air. Father O'Connell cried out, a sharp, choked sound. He stumbled, clutching at his chest. He fell to his knees, his eyes wide with surprise. He looked down at his own hands, and a look of profound confusion crossed his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He pitched forward onto the path and lay still. There was no wound, no mark. He was simply stopped, like a clock that had been silenced. Jedediah stared at the priest's still form, then back at the smiling child. The last ember of hope in his soul turned to ash. There was no bargain, there was no escape, there was only the creature, and it had come for him. He did the only thing a cornered animal can do. He ran. He turned his back on the boy and the dead priest and sprinted down the ridge towards the distant lights of Sedalia. He ran with a wild, desperate energy born of pure terror. The ground was uneven, treacherous. He stumbled, fell, and got back up, his hands and knees raw and bleeding. He did not care. He could hear the sound of the town, the bark of a dog, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer. It was the sound of life, the sound of a world that did not know about things that crawl out of the earth. He did not hear footsteps behind him. He did not hear whispers. He only felt a growing cold at his back, a creeping, unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. It was the cold of the mine, the cold of the deep places. It was gaining on him. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The boy was not running. He was walking. He moved with a slow, deliberate, unhurried pace. And yet, the distance between them was closing. The world seemed to warp around the small figure. The path shortened. The trees bent away from him. The boy was not moving through the landscape. The landscape was rearranging itself to bring him closer. Jedediah screamed, a raw, wordless sound of ultimate despair. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He could see the first houses of the town now, their windows glowing with warm orange lamplight. He could see people, a woman shaking out a rug on her porch, two men talking by a fence, safety, sanity. It was just a few hundred yards away. The cold at his back intensified. It felt like a physical hand pressing against him. He could feel it seeping into his skin, into his bones. He could feel the strength leaving his limbs. His legs grew heavy, sluggish. It was like running through deep water. He glanced back again. The boy was closer now. So close. He was still walking, his expression serene. He was holding up the locket again, letting it catch the lamplight from the town. He was offering a final gift. Jedediah Hale fell. His legs simply gave out. He crashed to the ground at the very edge of the town's outer road, his face in the dirt. He tried to crawl. He clawed at the ground, his fingers digging into the earth, trying to pull himself those last few feet into the light, into the world of men. He felt a small hand on his shoulder. It was not heavy. It was a child's touch, but it held him in place with the weight of the mountain. The whispering chorus filled his mind, a deafening roar of 100 stolen voices. But through the storm, he heard the clear, cold voice of the boy, speaking softly in his ear. It said, "Welcome home, Mr. Hale." The world dissolved. He did not feel the ground open. He did not feel a fall. He simply felt a shift, a folding of reality. The sounds of the town, the light from the windows, the smell of wood smoke, all of it faded away, replaced by the deep, silent cold and the smell of damp earth and ancient stone. He was in the dark, a total, complete, and final darkness. It was a narrow space. The rock pressed in on all sides, scraping his skin. He could not move his arms or legs. He could only lie there, entombed, and he was not alone. He could hear the breathing, the slow, dry, rhythmic breathing of the mountain, and he could hear the whispers. They were inside him now, exploring the corners of his mind, sifting through his memories, learning the shape of his life. They were taking his stories. They were taking his fears. They were taking his name. He tried to scream, but he had no voice. He had no breath. He was just a consciousness, trapped in the rock, listening as he was unmade, listening as the Gia's taker made room. He had one final coherent thought before the darkness took him completely. He thought of the message he had seen scrawled in tar on the collapsed mine shaft, the one found by the state surveyor months later. He had never seen it himself, but now, in this final moment, he understood it perfectly. We made room. It didn't need much. The surveyor who found the abandoned Clayridge mine in the autumn of 1832 found little else. The camp was deserted, the buildings already beginning to rot. He found the collapsed main shaft and the crude message. He found a foreman's logbook in one of the offices. The last entry was dated weeks before the collapse. It spoke of geological anomalies and difficult workers. It ended with the sentence, "All is well. Production is steady." He found a small, ruined chapel. Inside, a priest's Bible lay open on the floor. It was open to the book of Job. A single passage was underlined in a frantic, spidery hand. "Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep?" No formal investigation was ever opened. The Clayridge Mining Company quietly dissolved a year later, its owner, Mr. Silas Croft, having lost his entire investment. He died a ruined and bitter man. The story of the lost miners became a local ghost story, a cautionary tale told to children, but the land remembers more than the people do. In old maps, the area is sometimes marked with a simple notation, Terra Periculosa, dangerous ground. And in the deeper mines, the ones that were sunk years later, miles away, some of the old miners still claim that from time to time, they break into narrow, ancient fissures. Fissures that should not be there. Fissures that seem to breathe with a cold, dry air. Fissures that are slowly, patiently, widening, waiting. The official record ends there. A sealed mine, a bankrupt company, a footnote in the county ledger. History, in its neat and orderly fashion, closed the book on the Clayridge Mining Company. But the thing that slept beneath the mountain did not read books. It did not care for ledgers. It kept its own accounts, carved in stone and memory. The story should have ended with Jedediah Hale's disappearance at the edge of town. It should have faded into folklore, but the Gia's taker was not content. It had collected the names of the miners. It had consumed the foreman. It had tasted the outside world, and it had found that it was still lonely. The town of Sedalia, Kentucky, in 1832, was a small, pious community. It was a place of hard work and simple faith. They knew the rhythms of the seasons and the words of the Bible. They did not know about the things that walk out of the woods wearing the faces of children. The first sign that something was wrong was small, unsettling, but easily dismissed. A farmer on the edge of town, a man named Hezekiah Jones, swore that he saw the trapper boy, Thomas, walking along the road one evening. He called out to him, asking what he was doing so far from the mining camp. The boy had simply smiled, a wide, empty smile, and then walked into the woods. Hezekiah assumed he was a runaway. He told the sheriff, who made a note of it and did nothing. No one was looking for the miners anymore. They were presumed dead, buried in their own foolishness. Then, other children in the town started talking. They spoke of a new boy they had met in the woods, a quiet boy with pale skin and cold hands. They called him Thomas. He taught them new games with no rules and no laughter. He taught them old songs, lullabies in a language none of them understood. When their parents asked to meet this new friend, the children would say that Thomas was shy, that he only came out at dusk. The adults paid it little mind. Children have imaginary friends. They tell stories. But the stories began to change. A little girl named Sarah told her mother that Thomas had shown her where her grandmother had hidden her silver brooch before she died. The brooch was found exactly where the girl said it would be, a place no one else could have known. A boy claimed Thomas knew the name of the man who had been stealing chickens from his father's coop. When confronted, the man confessed. The children of Sedalia were becoming conduits for impossible secret knowledge. They spoke of old sins, of quiet betrayals, of deals made in darkness. The adults grew uneasy. They started watching their children more closely. They told them to stay away from the woods, to stay away from the boy named Thomas. But the children did not listen. They were drawn to him. He knew their secrets too. He knew their fears. He knew their desires. He was their friend. Then came the disappearances. It was not like at the mine. It was not the men who vanished. It was the small things, personal, sentimental objects. A woman's wedding ring, left on a windowsill, was gone. A man's favorite whittling knife vanished from his pocket. A child's christening cup, stolen from a locked chest. The town was beset by a plague of petty, inexplicable thefts. There was no sign of forced entry. The objects simply ceased to be where they were. The unease in the town began to curdle into a low-grade, simmering fear. People started locking their doors at night. They looked at their neighbors with suspicion. The easy trust that had bound the community together began to fray. The town pastor, a man named Reverend John Abernathy, tried to calm his flock. He preached sermons about the evils of gossip and suspicion. He said it was the devil trying to sow discord among them. He did not know how right he was. The entity that wore Thomas's face was learning. It had learned the miners' fears. Now it was learning the town's. It was not just a collector of names anymore. It was a collector of secrets, a collector of trust. It was feeding on the social fabric of Sedalia, one stolen secret, one broken friendship at a time. It was a more subtle form of consumption, but just as complete. It still lived in the woods. It still used the boy's form as its avatar, but it was weaving itself into the life of the town. It was making a new home. A young doctor, a man named Elias Vance, was the first to suspect the truth was something more than a phantom thief or childish fantasy. He was a man of science, newly arrived from Philadelphia. He was a rationalist who believed in observation and evidence. He began to notice a pattern. The children who spoke most often of their friend Thomas, the ones who knew the most secrets, were all becoming pale, anemic. They were listless, tired. They had a faint, cold clamminess to their skin, even on the warmest days. It was as if some vital energy was being slowly siphoned out of them. He also noticed the frost. On warm summer mornings, he would find delicate, fern-like patterns of white frost on the doorsteps of the houses where these children lived. It was a cold that did not belong. A cold he could not explain. It reminded him of stories he had read about consumption, but this was different. This was a sickness of the soul, manifesting in the body. He tried to speak to Reverend Abernathy about his concerns. The Reverend was dismissive. He accused Dr. Vance of being an outsider, of trying to bring his godless city science into their community of faith. The town was turning inward, growing suspicious of anyone who questioned the simple narrative of a mischievous ghost. The entity's game escalated. It grew bolder. One Sunday, during the Reverend's sermon, as he spoke of the sanctity of confession, a small girl in the front pew stood up. It was Sarah, the same girl who had found her grandmother's brooch. She stood up and, in a clear, high voice, she began to list the secret sins of every person in the church. She spoke of the deacon's affair with the blacksmith's wife. She spoke of the sheriff's hidden bottle of whiskey. She spoke of the Reverend's own secret pride. She recited a litany of the town's private shames, her voice devoid of emotion, her eyes distant and empty. The church erupted into chaos. Accusations flew. Shouts turned to blows. Families were torn apart in minutes. The quiet, pious community of Sedalia shattered. In the midst of the pandemonium, Dr. Vance saw him. Standing in the open doorway at the back of the church, half hidden in shadow, was the boy, Thomas. He was watching the chaos he had created, a look of serene, detached interest on his face. He caught Dr. Vance's eye, and he smiled. Then he turned and melted back into the sunlight. Dr. Vance knew then that he was not dealing with a ghost or a sickness. He was dealing with an intelligence, a malevolent, ancient intelligence that was playing a game with the town as its board. He began his own investigation. He was a man of science, but he was not a fool. He knew that the tools of his trade were useless here. He needed a different kind of knowledge. He rode to the next county, to the diocesan office, and asked to see their archives. He was looking for a Jesuit missionary's journal, for any mention of a Gaius taker, for any story that smelled of cold earth and stolen names. He found what he was looking for in a dusty, forgotten corner. It was not the Jesuit journal itself, but a letter referencing it. A letter written by a terrified priest named Michael O'Connell, sent from a place called the Clayridge mine. The letter spoke of an entity that consumed men and carved their names in stone. It begged for help, for a ritual, for a way to fight it. Attached to the letter was a reply from the diocese. It was cold, bureaucratic. It reprimanded Father O'Connell for indulging in local superstition. It denied his request for the rites of exorcism. It advised him to pray and tend to his flock. It was a death sentence, written on church letterhead. Dr. Vance sat in the dusty archive, the letters in his hand, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the old stone building. He now knew the creature's history. He knew its name. He knew that it had come from the mine. And he knew that it had followed the last survivor, Jedediah Hale, to Sedalia. He returned to the town, a changed man. The rationalist had been burned away, leaving behind a grim realist who understood that some things in the world did not obey the laws of nature. He knew that the town was not just haunted, it was infested. He knew that the entity fed on secrets, on discord, on fear. It was breaking the town down, piece by piece, to make it more digestible. He realized with a jolt of terror what its endgame was. It was not just playing with them, it was cultivating them. It was turning Sedalia into a new garden, a new place to harvest names. The boy, Thomas, was no longer just a scout. He was the gardener, and he was just getting started. Dr. Elias Vance now possessed the most dangerous thing in Sedalia, a piece of the truth. He understood that the sickness corrupting the town was not a moral failing or a spiritual crisis that could be prayed away. It was a predator, and like any predator, it had patterns. It had needs. He believed it could be fought. He began to work in secret, his medical practice becoming a cover for a desperate epidemiological study of a supernatural plague. He documented everything: the pale, listless children, the impossible frosts on summer mornings, the stolen objects. He cross-referenced the secrets revealed by the children with the subsequent misfortunes that befell the accused. He saw a clear, chilling pattern of cause and effect. The entity was not just revealing secrets, it was using them as weapons to isolate and weaken its chosen victims. He tried to approach the families of the afflicted children, to warn them. But the town had fractured into bitter, suspicious clans. The parents of the gifted children were now protective of their special status. Their children were oracles, prophets. They held a strange new power in the town's shattered social landscape. They would not listen to the outsider doctor and his wild theories. They saw him as a threat to their newfound influence. Dr. Vance realized he was alone. The Reverend was a broken man, his authority in ruins. The sheriff was overwhelmed, trying to keep a lid on a town that was boiling over with paranoia and resentment. If Sedalia was to be saved, he would have to save it himself. His research into the old church letters had given him one sliver of hope. Father O'Connell had mentioned a ritual, an exchange, a name for a name. The priest had been wrong about how it worked, but the principle might still be valid. The Gaius taker was bound by rules. Ancient, inscrutable rules, but rules nonetheless. It could not simply take. It had to be given. It had to be invited. Every secret it used, every man it took, was the result of a subtle, unspoken bargain. The entity's primary vessel, the boy Thomas, was its anchor to the community. He was the point of infection. If Dr. Vance could sever that connection, perhaps he could starve the creature. He began to watch the boy, not the real Thomas, who was likely a smear of dust in a forgotten fissure, but the thing that wore his skin. He followed it at a distance, a ghost hunting a ghost. He watched it meet with the other children at the edge of the woods. He observed its movements, its habits. It never ate. It never slept. It just walked, and watched, and listened. It was a perfect imitation of a living thing, but it was hollow. It was a puppet, and Dr. Vance could almost feel the strings stretching back into the deep, cold earth of the mountains. His chance came during the town's annual Founders' Day picnic. It was a hollow affair that year, a pathetic attempt to pretend that the community was not tearing itself apart. The families gathered in the town square, but they stayed in their own small, tense groups. The laughter was forced. The smiles were brittle. The children, however, were drawn together. They played near the Old Town Well in the center of the square, and with them, moving among them like a shadow, was the boy, Thomas. He was the center of their strange little cult, the quiet king of the pale children. Dr. Vance had a plan. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble, a piece of psychological surgery he was not sure he could perform. He knew the entity fed on secrets. He decided to offer it a new one, a secret it could not resist. He had spent weeks poring over the town records, the old deeds and family Bibles. He was looking for the town's own original sin, the lie upon which Sedalia had been founded. He found it in a property dispute from a generation earlier. The land on which the town square stood, the very heart of the community, had not been purchased honorably. It had been stolen through a forged document and a false testimony from a poor farmer who had later been found dead, an apparent suicide. The founding fathers of Sedalia had built their town on a crime. It was a secret that had been buried for 50 years. Dr. Vance waited until the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the square. He walked calmly towards the group of children by the well. They fell silent as he approached, their strange old eyes watching him. He ignored them. He looked directly at the boy, Thomas. "I know a secret," Dr. Vance said, his voice quiet but clear. "A big one. It's the secret of this place, the secret of Sedalia." The boy's head tilted. The air grew colder. The other children took a step back, as if sensing a shift in the currents of power. The entity was listening. "I know who killed the man who owned this land," Dr. Vance continued, his voice steady, his eyes locked on the boy's empty face. "I know his name, and I know where he is buried." This was a lie. The records were unclear on the man's fate, but it was a powerful lie. It was a secret that went to the very root of the creature's new home. The boy took a step closer. The whispering chorus started in Dr. Vance's mind, a frantic, hungry sound. It wanted the secret. It demanded it. "I will tell you," Dr. Vance said, "but not here. You must come with me, alone." He turned and began to walk away from the square, towards the small, clapboard building that served as his medical office and home. He did not look back. He had baited the hook. He prayed the creature would take it. He heard the soft footsteps behind him. It was following. He led it into his office. The room was clean, orderly, smelling of carbolic acid and herbs. It was a room of science and reason. He lit a lantern, its clean light pushing back the gathering gloom. The boy stood in the doorway, a figure of archaic darkness silhouetted against the twilight. "The secret," the whispering voice demanded, coming from the boy's mouth. "Tell us. First, you must tell me something," Dr. Vance said, turning to face his adversary. "What do you want?" The boy smiled, his terrible, wide smile. "We want everything," the chorus whispered. "We want all the stories, all the names. We want this town." "You are a collector," Dr. Vance said, his voice gaining strength. "You take things, but you cannot take what is freely given. That is the rule, isn't it?" The entity's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The doctor had guessed right. "I will give you a name," Dr. Vance said. "A true name. A name more powerful than any secret. But you must make an exchange. You must release the children. You must release this town." The whispers laughed. It was the sound of 1,000 winters. It said that a doctor's name was a small thing. It had a foreman's name. It had dozens of miners' names. Why would it trade a whole town for just one more? "Not my name," Dr. Vance said, his heart pounding. He reached into his coat and pulled out an object. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, taken from the trophy tree in the woods. He had retrieved it on one of his secret excursions. "I am offering you its name," he said, holding up the bird. "I am offering you your own." The silence in the room was absolute. The entity stared at the small, carved bird. It was a crude representation of itself, made by a long-dead hand, a name given to it by its first victims, a name it had perhaps forgotten. The whispers in Dr. Vance's head recoiled, a sound of confusion and ancient fear. To be named is to be known. To be known is to be limited. To be limited is to be vulnerable. "You are the Geas taker," Dr. Vance said, pressing his advantage. "The one who lives in the stone, the lonely one. That is your name. I give it to you. Now, you will uphold your end of the bargain. You will leave this place and these people. That is the rule." The boy, Thomas, began to tremble. A low, keening sound came from his throat, a sound of rage and pain. The air in the room grew ice-cold. Frost spread in fractal patterns across the floorboards, creeping out from the boy's feet. The lantern flame flickered, burning a sickly green. "You cannot," the chorus hissed, its power wavering. "You cannot name us." "I already have," Dr. Vance said. "Now go." The boy let out a final, piercing shriek. It was a sound that was not human, a sound of grinding rock and tearing earth. The windows of the office rattled in their frames. The glass cracked. Then, the boy's body convulsed violently and collapsed to the floor. The cold receded. The lantern flame burned bright and yellow again. The presence in the room was gone. Lying on the floor was the still, pale body of a 12-year-old boy. Just a boy. His eyes were closed. He looked like he was sleeping. Dr. Elias Vance knelt and felt for a pulse. There was none. The puppet's strings had been cut, and the puppet had died. He had won. He had faced the monster and named it. He had driven it out. He stumbled outside into the cool night air, his body shaking with adrenaline and relief. The nightmare was over. Sedalia was saved. He did not know that he had not driven it out. He had only driven it down. Down, back into the earth, back into the fissures and the deep places where it slept. He had given it its name back. He had reminded it of what it was, and he had made it angry. A thing like that does not forget a hurt. A thing like that is patient. It could wait. For another mine, for another town, for another lonely child. Dr. Vance had not won a war. He had only survived a single, terrible battle, and he had left the monster with a new story to tell. The story of the doctor who knew its name. The change in Sedalia was not immediate. It was like the slow breaking of a fever. The day after the confrontation in Dr. Vance's office, the children woke up as just children. The paleness was gone from their cheeks. The old knowing light was gone from their eyes. They cried for their friend Thomas, who had vanished as mysteriously as he had arrived. They had no memory of the secrets they had told or the discord they had sown. To them, It was only the sad end of a summer friendship. The stolen objects began to reappear. A wedding ring would be found nestled in a bird's nest. A whittling knife would be lying in the middle of the road, clean and untouched. The town's collective memory of the terror began to soften, to blur. The raw, open wounds of betrayal and suspicion scarred over. People chose to forget. It was easier to believe in a season of bad blood or a shared madness than to confront the reality of what had lived among them. Dr. Elias Vance became a quiet hero, though no one but he knew the full extent of the battle he had won. They knew only that he had been the voice of reason when madness reigned. He had faced down the superstitions. He had cured the children of their strange malady. His reputation was solidified. He was no longer the outsider. He was the town's protector. He buried the body of the boy, Thomas, himself. He rowed out to a small, forgotten island in the middle of the Ohio River and interred him in a deep, unmarked grave. He said a few words, not of prayer, but of apology. An apology to a child whose body had been stolen and used as a vessel for an ancient evil. For years, there was peace. Sedalia healed. The fissures in the community closed, much like the ones in the earth. Dr. Vance married a local woman, had children of his own. He grew older. The terrible memories of the mine and the monster faded. Becoming a dark story he kept locked in the deepest part of his mind. He had faced the darkness and won. He had built a life in the light. He allowed himself to believe it was over. He was wrong. The Gias taker was patient. It had been named, and in being named, it had been diminished. It had been driven back into the rock, its influence curtailed. But it had not been destroyed. It had been given a gift more valuable than any secret or soul, a purpose. It now had an adversary, an enemy, the doctor who knew its name. The first hint that the piece was a lie came 30 years later. It was the winter of 1862. The nation was tearing itself apart in a great civil war. The horrors of that conflict overshadowed all other fears, but a new story began to circulate in the region, a story from the Union Field Hospital set up near Shiloh, not 50 miles from the old Clayridge mine. Soldiers, delirious with fever and morphine, spoke of a boy, a quiet boy with pale skin and cold hands who walked the long rows of cots at night. He was not a nurse, he was not a visitor. He just walked, and watched, and listened. The soldiers called him the Good Death, because the men he stood beside the longest were always gone by morning. They died peacefully in their sleep, a faint, serene smile on their lips. The surgeons, overworked and exhausted, dismissed it as the fantasy of dying men. But then the whispers started again. Not in Sedalia, but in the camps. A soldier would suddenly confess to desertion. Another would reveal a hidden stash of stolen supplies. The fragile bonds of trust that held the army units together began to rot from within. Paranoia and suspicion became as deadly as any Confederate bullet. Dr. Vance heard these stories from wounded men who passed through Sedalia, and the old, cold dread returned. The Gias taker had found a new place of misery, a new harvest. The war was a feast for it. It was no longer a local spirit bound to a single mountain. It was learning to travel. He began to see signs closer to home. A child in Sedalia would wake from a nightmare, speaking of a boy with empty eyes. An old farmer would find a single, child-sized footprint in the frost by his barn, with too many toes. They were faint echoes, probes. The creature was testing the boundaries of its old prison, checking to see if the warden was still on duty. Dr. Vance grew old. His hair turned white. His hands, which had been so steady, now trembled slightly. He was the town's beloved doctor, its wise old man, but he lived with a secret terror. He felt like a man living in a house with a wolf chained in the cellar. The chain was long, but he could hear it rattling in the night. On his 75th birthday, he received a package. It was a small, crudely wrapped box, left on his doorstep. There was no return address. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry leaves, was a small, carved wooden bird, the same one he had held up in his office 50 years before, the one he had thrown into the Ohio River, and beneath it was a single, tarnished silver locket. He knew then that his time was running out. The creature was no longer content to feast on the chaos of the wider world. It was coming back for him. It was coming to close its account. He did not tell his family. He did not want to taint their peace with his old horror. He did the only thing he could. He began to write. He took out sheets of clean paper and, in his neat, practiced hand, he wrote down everything. The story of the Clayridge mine, of Jedediah Hale, of Father O'Connell, of the boy, Thomas. He wrote about the Gias taker, the creature that lived in the stone. He wrote about the rules, about the power of names. He wrote down everything he knew, a final act of defiance, a message in a bottle. He wrote for 3 days, his old hand cramping, his mind sharp and clear with the clarity of a man facing his end. When he was finished, he sealed the manuscript in a thick oilcloth packet. He gave it to his eldest son, a lawyer, and made him promise to deliver it to the archives of the Miskatonic University in Arkham, Massachusetts. He told his son it was a historical account of some local folklore, but that the academics there would find it of interest. He knew they were collectors of a different sort, collectors of forbidden knowledge he hoped they would understand. That night, a cold fog rolled into Sedalia, unseasonable and thick. It clung to the ground, muffling all sound. Dr. Vance sat in his office, the same room where he had faced the creature half a century before. He did not light a lamp. He sat in the darkness, and he waited. Around midnight, he heard a soft scratching at his door, a familiar sound, like a fingernail being dragged across wood. Then came a giggle, a child's giggle, filled with ancient, patient malice. The door creaked open. A small figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. It was the boy. He had not aged a day. He spoke, and the voice was a chorus of all the men and all the secrets it had consumed over the long years. It was a voice of pure, cold triumph. "Doctor," the whispers said, "we have missed you." The official report stated that Dr. Elias Vance died peacefully in his sleep of old age, a beloved member of the community, mourned by all. His family found him in his office chair, a serene, placid smile on his face. The window was open, and the room was unnaturally cold. The family found him that way in the morning. The smile was the most unsettling part. It was not a smile of peace. It was the smile of a man who has just been told a joke so profound, so final, that he will never need to laugh again. The town coroner, a man who had been Dr. Vance's own student, wrote natural causes on the certificate. But he would later tell his own son that he had never, in all his years, felt a room so cold on a warm spring morning. It was a detail he left out of the official report, a final act of respect for his mentor, a final act of denial. Dr. Vance's eldest son, a lawyer named William, grieved for his father. He was a man of evidence and reason, and he saw his father's final manuscript as a symptom of a brilliant mind succumbing to the fancies of old age. Still, a promise was a promise. He wrapped the oilcloth packet carefully and took the train north to Massachusetts. He felt a sense of filial duty, mixed with a faint, private embarrassment. He was delivering a ghost story to a university. He arrived at Miskatonic University on a crisp autumn day. The Orne Library was a fortress of granite and ivy, and it smelled of old paper and decaying leather. He was met by the head librarian, a quiet, ageless man whose eyes seemed to hold the dust of all the books he had ever read. William explained his father's last request, his tone slightly apologetic. The librarian took the packet without a word of judgment. His expression did not change. He simply nodded and assured William that the document would be given a thorough reading. William Vance left the library feeling a sense of relief. He had fulfilled his duty. He went on to have a long and successful career in law, and the strange manuscript his father had written faded from his memory. He died an old man, never knowing that his father's final act had not been one of folklore, but of testimony. The head librarian did not file the manuscript under local history. He took it to a small, private room in the library's sub-basement, a room with no windows and a heavy iron door. He sat and read Dr. Vance's account from beginning to end. He read of the Clayridge mine and the fissures. He read of the whispers and the stolen names. He read of the boy, Thomas, and the doctor who had faced him. As he read, he showed no surprise. He showed no fear. He showed only a deep, weary recognition. When he was finished, he did not return the manuscript to the main archives. He walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. He unlocked it with a heavy iron key. Inside were dozens of other documents, each telling a different story, but each with the same cold heart. He saw the water-stained journal of a whaling captain from Nantucket, dated 1790. The captain wrote of a cabin boy who never ate, who could whisper the location of the whales, but whose presence caused the crew to turn on each other with murderous paranoia. He saw a series of letters from a cavalry officer in the West, dated 1870. The officer described a strange native child who wandered into their fort, a child who could foretell the outcomes of skirmishes, but whose friendship led to a plague of suicides and desertions. He saw telegrams, diaries, and confessions, all speaking of a quiet, patient evil that collected secrets and traded them for names. It was a thing with 1,000 faces, but only one appetite. The librarian placed Dr. Vance's manuscript on the shelf. He made a new entry in a private ledger, his handwriting as neat and precise as a surgeon's incision. Source: Vance, E. Location: Sedalia, KY. Manifestation: Gia's Taker. Status: dormant. Adversary: consumed. He was wrong about one thing. The Gia's Taker was not dormant, it had merely changed. By consuming Dr. Vance, it had consumed his knowledge, his logic, his understanding of systems. It had been a creature of the deep earth, of rock and shadow. Now it had learned a new language, the language of medicine, of law, of bureaucracy. It no longer needed to haunt a single town or mine. The world was changing. The nation was stitching itself together with railroads and telegraph wires. Great cities were rising, filled with millions of lonely people, their heads full of secrets and fears. It was a hunting ground more vast and fertile than any Appalachian forest. The fissures it now exploited were not in stone. They were in the fine print of a contract, in the loophole of a law, in the classified ad that promised a new life to a desperate family. It became a rumor that bankrupted a company. It was the misplaced file that sent an innocent man to prison. It was the quiet, institutional knowledge that ensured the powerful were protected and the weak were consumed. It learned that a signature was a name, a debt was a chain. A secret, whispered in the right ear in Washington or New York, could be a more effective weapon than any claw or whisper in the dark. It did not need the face of a child anymore. It had 1,000 new faces. It was the silent partner in a failing business, the anonymous source in a scandalous news report, the quiet clerk in a records office who ensures a certain document is lost forever. It had learned from Dr. Vance that the greatest power lies not in overt monstrosity, but in the quiet, patient manipulation of the system. The story of Sedalia became a quaint local legend. The statue of Dr. Vance in the town square stands to this day, a monument to a man whose victory was so complete and so temporary. The town itself never quite recovered the trust it had lost. It remained a place of quiet grudges and long memories, a place with a permanent chill. And in the locked room, in the sub-basement of a library in Massachusetts, the stories wait. The manuscript of Dr. Vance sits beside the others, a chorus of silent testimony. They are a record of the creature's long life, its education, its evolution. They are not an ending. They are a warning that the oldest evils do not die. They just learn to fill out the proper paperwork. That's all we have for now. The rest was never written down. Or if it was, no one lived to read it. If this stayed with you, leave a like and subscribe for more from the archive.